Yeah, welcome. I'm Barry Shaw. This is The View from Israel. And today we have a very special guest. I'm delighted to introduce David Bedin. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you very
David is,
much.
is the director of the Center for Near East Policy Research. And he's the authoritative voice in reporting the gross abuses and the practices of UNRWA, the United Nations refugee agency that deals exclusively with the Palestinian refugees. And I have a great respect for this man. That David has single handedly brought the results of his research to the attention of Western leaders and government. So, welcome, David. I'm honored to have you here today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, but we're not here to talk about UNRWA. I want to have you back to talk about your work on another show. But today we're talking about Haj Amin al Husseini, the father of Palestinian Jew hatred and genocide, including his links to the Nazis. Um, it's enormously relevant, viewers, to hear this show because what we're going to do in today's show is make what happened in the past history very relevant to the situation we find ourselves in today. Today, we see Western complicity in ignoring Palestinian incitement and violence against Jews. In their appeasement, they fund the Palestinian Authority, who then reward their killers in their pay to slay policy. And this encourages them, it lets them off the hook. Nothing new, been going on for 100 years. So, David, I've asked David on the show to talk about the years of Haj Amin al Husseini's contacts with the Nazis and his anti Semitism. But his Jew hatred started way before that. In fact, I detail it in my book, 1917, From Palestine to the Land of Israel. The British liberated Palestine in the Palestine campaign and liberated Jerusalem in December 1917. Jerusalem at that time, and still has ever since, had a Jewish majority. But despite the Jewish majority, the British allowed an Arab mayor to be elected to govern under the British Jerusalem. Now, the British filled their senior posts in Jerusalem and in Palestine with a number of senior officers who came up from Egypt, and they were anti Semitic, but they were in very serious senior positions. Among those was General Bowles and the Colonel Harry Waters Taylor, two hardened anti Semites who whipped up the Arabs to protest British intentions to carry out their policy in reconstituting Jewish national homeland in Palestine, which was British policy as a result of the Balfour Declaration. And they did it through the Arab mayor of Jerusalem and through one particular Islamist rabble rouser, Haj Amin al Husseini. And together, they planned Arab riots in the old city of Jerusalem to coincide with the annual Nebi Musa festival. Now, traditionally, this was a festive Arab festival with marching and music and feasting. But in 1920, it was something completely different. Both the mayor and Al Hussein whipped up a frenzy among the Arabs who came to the event. And knowing it was about to happen, the officer, Waters Taylor, absented himself from Jerusalem. He took his wife down to Jericho to be out away from the scene on a day trip. And the Arabs, incited by al Husseini, began to loot and burn Jewish properties, rape Jewish women, attack, maim, and kill the Jews in the old city of Jerusalem. Now, you have to be aware that there was a force of Palestinian Jews in Jerusalem, in Palestine, who had fought alongside the British in the Jewish Legion to liberate Palestine from the Turks and the Germans. Now, Zev Jabotinsky had been an officer in the Jewish Legion under the command of Colonel John Patterson. And when he heard about the violence and the riots going on against the Jews in the old city, he rushed with some of his men to try and rescue the Jews. But he wasn't allowed in the old city. It was guarded by British and Indian troops that wouldn't allow him in. So he went to Ronald Storrs, who was the military governor in that time, and complained about the massacre that was going on. The outcome of this was that Jabotinsky was arrested, put on trial, sentenced for being in illegal possession of weapons, and sentenced to 15 years in jail. Haj Amin al-Husseini, who had instigated the frenzy which led to the murder of Jews and the rape of women, was sentenced to 10 years. But he didn't serve a day. He didn't serve a day because the British allowed him out on bail and he escaped to Syria. One more point about Haj Amin al-Husseini. No Palestinian Arab at that time, at the time of the Palestine campaign, west of the River Jordan, volunteered to fight with the British to liberate Palestine from the Turks and the Germans. On the contrary, al-Husseini did the opposite. He served as an officer in an artillery unit in the Turkish army. And yet what we have here is the British officer colluding with someone who had served in the army of the enemy to defy British policy and incite riots and violence against Jews in Jerusalem. Think about that for a minute. So after the Nebi Musa bloodshed, the British appointed a new governor, high commissioner for Jerusalem, for Palestine. Sir Herbert Samuel was a Jew, and he was eager to appease the Arabs. And one of the first things he did was he granted a pardon to Haj Amin al-Husseini and allowed him back into Palestine, where he was appointed the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Now, this appeasement we saw at a time of Arafat, in my opinion, after the Oslo Accord. Arafat and his PLO had had decades of incessant anti-Jewish riots and terrorism. But as Herbert Samuel said at the time, and I quote, he did it in order that the influence of his family and himself would be devoted to tranquility. So how did that work out? Within weeks of his return, al-Husseini campaigned to renovate the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, a statement that Islam ruled Jerusalem. And on his return, he started new tactics to manage to interfere with the Jewish rights to pray at the Western Wall, which is part of the Temple Mount. Tisha B'Av, another festival where Jews came to pray at the ruins of the Temple Mount, he instigated a riot by claiming that the Jews, Al-Aqsa Mosque was in danger by the Jews. We hear this today. We hear it from Yasser Arafat. We hear it with Mahmoud Abbas. And the Arabs attacked the Jews, and the rioting was widespread around Jerusalem. So when the Jews wanted to come to the Temple Mount at Tisha B'Av, the holy festival, Haj Amin al-Husseini whipped up the incitement to the Arabs by claiming that the Jews were coming to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I think we're familiar with that, both with Arafat and more recently with Mahmoud Abbas. The result of that, there was widespread rioting and murder against Jews. In total, 139 Jews were killed all the way from Tzfat in the north to Petah Tikva to Jaffa, and 69 slaughtered in Hebron. Following this, the rioting continued to 1937, an arrest warrant was issued against al-Husseini on the 29th of September 1937, but the Mufti and several members of the Arab High Command somehow managed to flee to Beirut. By 1941, Haj Amin al-Husseini and his cohorts had infiltrated Baghdad's ruling circles. The Iraqi government financed the Mufti, and he used the Iraqi government's opposition to the British to forge ties with Germany. And he began sending emissaries to Berlin. But in Iraq, he hadn't finished with the Jews. Al-Husseini, together with leading Iraqi Muslims, began to plan pogroms and riots against the Jews of Iraq, who had been among the middle class in that country. there was an attempted coup, and the British Army began to move into Iraq. And the leader of the coup and others, together with al Husseini, fled Baghdad for, first of all, Persia, Iran, of course, today, and from there to Berlin. However, before he fled, the spark had been lit and the Fahud began. The Fahud is described as the Iraqi genocide of the Jews. The British witnessed the riots and the murder of Jews, but did little to interfere. They considered it a domestic squabble. The British concerns were really more about Iraqi oil and keeping it out of the hands of the Turks and the Germans. In June 1941, during another Jewish festival, it's amazing how these Arab exhibitions of slaughter of Jews always happen on Jewish festivals. The rioting and the murder began. It spread throughout Iraq. Those who weren't killed fled. Days later, the oil was secure. The Jews weren't. Those who could get out of Iraq made aliyah to Palestine or fled to America. Now, the Fahud means violent dispossession. The Iraqi Jews didn't know the word Holocaust, but this was the opening attack of Jews in World War II in the Middle East. It was done by the behest, not of the Germans, but of people like the Palestinian Mufti al-Husseini, who was on his way to Berlin.
Der Führer empfing den Großmufti von Jerusalem, einen der einflussreichsten Männer des arabischen Nationalismus. Der Großmufti ist das religiöse Oberhaupt der Araber in Palästina und gleichzeitig deren oberster Richter und Finanzverwalter.
And with that, I'm going to hand over the show to David Badin, to continue the story of Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem in Germany. David, take it from here.
What's most important and has been forgotten in this generation is that the protocols of the Hitler Hajj Amin Husseini protocols were actually brought to the Eichmann trial in 1961 to prove that Hajj Amin Husseini not only conspired with Hitler, but he lived in Hitler's bunker, and they forged the concept of the mass murder of the Jews. Now, at the Wannsee Conference in 1941, which took place on November 28, 1941, Hajj Amin Husseini was there, and he's helped forge all of the deal. All the deals that the concept was that the Nazis would murder the Jews in Europe, and the Mufti would organize the murder of more than 1 million Jews in the Arab countries, and beginning, of course, with Palestine. Now, there was a gentleman named Morris Perlman, who later became the first head of the Israel government press office in 1948. But before that, in 46, he wrote a very important document called the Mufti of Jerusalem, in which he described the crucial role that the Mufti played in the mass murder of the Jews, his visits to the concentration camps, his creation of an Islamic SS unit, and the testimony of the SS prosecution witnesses who testify that Mufti, working directly under Eichmann and Himmler, identified the Mufti's instrumental role in making sure that millions of Jews were murdered, not simply ransomed. There were various efforts at the end of World War II, as many people know, to ransom Jews, to trade them Jews for trucks, things like this. But the Mufti stood in the way of that happening because he wanted the final solution. Incidentally, the question's often asked, I don't know how many people ask the question, how did we know? How did the people of the world know that the precise number of almost 6 million Jews being murdered? Well, this was not publicized by the Nazis, by the Germans. This was publicized by the Mufti, because the Mufti had access to German radio, the German radio station, in the Arabic language, which was broadcasting out of Hitler's bunker, and he was giving updates about the numbers of Jews who were being murdered. And in the last week before Hitler escaped the bunker, and somehow, by the way, the Mufti also escaped the bunker, which is a story in itself, they had the precise tabulation. It would have taken 10, 20 years to get that tabulation, to figure out how many Jews were killed, where, when, and how, and he had that tabulation precisely. Now, it's very important, and this connects, as Barry was hinting, this connects to the current situation today from what happened more than 70 years ago. Because when the Hajj Amin Husseini who was called the Mufti of Jerusalem, as you know, when he arrived in Cairo. He arrived in Cairo somehow in a mysterious escape from the Hitler's bunker to the. No one knows how he did it. It still has never been documented how he did it. Now, Morris Perlman, the journalist, he was at the time he got the information about the escape, and he had appealed to the British and American governments to arrest Haj Amin al-Husseini. And who was the man who was organizing the campaign for Haj Amin al-Husseini's arrest? None other than Ben-Zion Netanyahu, Mr. Netanyahu, the current prime minister's father, who was the head of the revisionist movement in the United States, and he started his own lobby of the U.S. Congress for this purpose, and very much influenced in 1946 the Republicans to the Republican victory in Congress, because they pushed this as a campaign issue. The American government must arrest Haj Amin al-Husseini, which they did not do. Now, what's very important to understand that he assumed his role. Haj Amin al-Husseini reassumed his role as a titular leader of the Arab world when he came to Cairo. He met with the first meetings of the Arab League, and he was the person who introduced the resolutions, which became the actually the program, the platform of the Arab League, calling for total Judenrein, total liquidation of the Jews as the purpose of the invasion in 1948. Now, what's very important to know is that the League of Arab Nations, which Haj Amin al-Husseini was amongst the founders, was one amongst the initiators, it is still in a war of extermination today. It's a war that was declared, and it's still going on. Even when Sadat made his peace deal with Israel in 1977 and 77 and signed it in 79, it did not cancel the office of the Arab League, which remains to this day in Cairo and also in Washington and other branches, different places. To understand that this is a continuing legacy of the Mufti, the continuing war. Now, after the loss in 1948, Haj Amin al-Husseini was credited with being the person who conceptualized the idea of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, whose charter, 1964 charter, right, which was ratified of all places at the Intercontinental Hotel on top of the Mount of Olives. His charter was inspired by none other than the Haj Amin al-Husseini, who basically copied it word for word from the Arab League's charter to the PLO charter. Incidentally, what's very important for people to know is that PLO charter was supposed to have been canceled or at least abrogated by the Oslo Accord. Well, our office, we work with the Israel Resource News Agency at the Center for Near East Policy Research. We dispatched a TV crew, the only TV crew which recorded and filmed the session of the PLO when they were supposed to cancel the covenant in 1996, when they never did. It's very important to understand that the legacy continues to this day. What Haj Amin al-Husseini authored in terms of the Arab League's program of liquidation and the PLO's covenant of liquidation continues to this day as the ultimate legacy. Now, one of the things we'll show you on this program I'm sharing with Larry, and so this program you can see it is the photographs of the video of Mahmoud Abbas, the current head of the Palestinian Authority, on January 14, 2013, when he invoked the memory of Haj Amin al-Husseini to inspire everyone as the ultimate role model for the Palestinian Arab nation. So this is very important. It's a kind of an invented nation, but that invention of a nation has has strength behind it, because it's not only the Palestinian Arabs or the Egyptian Arabs, but of course the kingpin of the Arab League is Saudi Arabia, which is still at war with Israel. Even though they make business with Israel, they're still at war with Israel. Same thing with the Arab League. People today talk about BDS, but much more lethal than BDS is the Arab boycott. How many people know that the Arab boycott continues to this day? That's one of the issues that people have forgotten. It's very important to know that we actually, as a news agency, which is part of our identity, we dispatched in 1996. We dispatched a journalist to speak with Yasser Arafat's younger brother and younger sister, who were old in age, and they had recollections of the Mufti. And we asked, what role did the Mufti play in the upbringing of the three of you after your father died in 1945? and it's very, very clear that when the Mufti arrived from Cairo to Cairo from Hitler's bunker, he became the greatest influence on the three siblings, Yasser Arafat, Fakhri Arafat, who became the head of the Palestinian Red Crescent, and their sister. And very important that they also his brother and sister said these were the two. This is the most important influence on Yasser Arafat's life. Yasser Arafat's father had died, and this was his cousin, and he became the titular father of Yasser Arafat. Very important to understand that someone of this ilk, who made his reputation as the first Arab leader to promote genocide of the Jews, he became the most influential person in the Palestinian Arab world, and also over Yasser Arafat, who became, of course, the head of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. And you see many similarities. That the Mufti did everything in stages, just like the Arafat did, and very wily, he knew how to play the Western leaders around his finger, and also at the same time have good relations with the Arab countries, so they had that proper balance there. So those are some of my thoughts about the Mufti. I was asked at the Knesset on Holocaust Day 5 years ago to make a presentation on the Mufti's legacy, and I can say it was not well received. It was not that people did not want to hear about the whole connection between the Mufti and the Nazis, between the Mufti and Hitler, the Arafat, between the Mufti and PLO. However, I gave the presentation. But as you may know, in Israel, there's a hesitancy to publicize what the other side says in Arabic, to the extent where we actually have on the record where a very senior person who just left his office in the Prime Minister's office, Michael Horan, who said to us on the record and on tape and on video that the school books of the Palestinian Authority, which basically are continue to promote genocide, were studied by the Israeli government and then put aside, and basically they made sure that the people of Israel would not know about it because it would hurt the peace process.
David, one of the things I always tell people abroad is you don't listen what people like, at that time, Arafat, today, Mahmoud Abbas, tell CNN and BBC in English. You have to listen to what they tell their own people in Arabic, because that's where the truth lies.
When Israeli civilians are murdered, the PA comes out to condemn the attacks.
President Arafat said, I want to be very clear, we are against any and every operation targeting civilians, whether they are Israelis or Palestinians.
But if the PA was taking steps to stamp out terror groups like Hamas, Israelis asked themselves why Yasser Arafat was seen on Palestinian television publicly praising Hamas terrorists.
وأنا بقول هذا الكلام في ذكرى هؤلاء الشهداء الأبطال العظام أبو إياد وأبو الهول وأبو محمد وقبلهم أبو جهاد وقبلهم يحيى عياش وبعدهم يحيى عياش.
Yahya Ayash, also known as the engineer, was the mastermind behind the first suicide bombings, a series of attacks that claimed more than 50 lives.
أطلب منكم يا إخواني قراءة الفاتحة على جميع شهدائنا وآخرهم الشهيد المهندس يحيى عياش.
And if anybody, whether it's in the Western world or even in the Israeli government, even worse, ignore what they're telling their own people, they're doing a disservice. So here's my final bite. I just want to tell people that Haj Amin al-Husseini did not incite violence against Jews to create a Palestinian state. He was in favor of a pan-Arab world. In fact, he was agreeable to be under the rule of an Arab king in Syria. Now, in a lot of this, Arafat, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Mahmoud Abbas are in fact alter egos of Haj Amin al-Husseini. Notice they reject the establishment of a Palestinian state as long as a Jewish state exists. They perpetuate and glorify the reward for the murder of Jews. Those that ignore history are destined to repeat the errors of the past. I hope that the words that I've given you, and in particular David Badin, encourage you to study more into this subject. David, thank you for joining me on the show. I look
Let
forward
me
to
have
having you back on. Go
one
ahead.
more word, please. We have put out a book called Genesis of the Palestinian Authority. This is what it looks like, and you can get it through Amazon. It's a thorough 573 page volume of 300 news stories that we covered concerning the Palestinian Authority. We're one of amongst the few agencies that interviewed Arafat and every leader of of Hamas, and we also cover their schools, their summer camps, their constitution, and we've had many scoops that people often ignore. And all I can say is you can see our website, IsraelBehindTheNews.com, and start looking through it and understand, get some more insights, because we're fighting against the mainstream media that does not want to publicize this material. It bothers everybody, but then again, the truth will make you free.
David, do you have any sort of email that you want to give our viewers in case everybody wants to contact you?
Sure. Through my website, IsraelBehindTheNews.com. Again, I repeat, IsraelBehindTheNews.com. Our email is embedded in that website.
I strongly recommend viewers that you get a copy of David's book. That gives you more relevant information. If you want to go back in history, get a copy of 1917, From Palestine to the Land of Israel. It's got a picture of Allenby walking into Jerusalem. It talks about the extraordinary early struggles of Jewish and Christian heroes to establish the state of Israel. This gives you a full picture of what has been going on for 100 years, where the Palestinian cause is preceded on the murder of Jews and the annihilation and destruction of Jews, rather than the establishment of a Palestinian state. Read my book, read David's book, watch and share this video, because this is where the truth of the issue lies. Thank you for joining us. I hope we've informed you. Thank you, David, for being on. I look forward to having you on a future show about the invaluable work you do against UNRWA. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Barry Shaw wrapping up the show for The View from Israel.